So we've been talking about the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic and talking about the technological innovations that accompany that transition in human history, right? So the next step I wanted to talk about, and this is again from your McClellan and Dorn, they have a little section called Moonshine. So that first section was grow your own. This section is moonshine. So you can see they've got a sort of tongue-in-cheek pun associated with, what could we say, recreational activities. At any rate, moonshine. What they're working on in this selection, among other things, are a couple of issues that are pretty much consistent with most ancient civilizations, and therefore this idea of science and society in early history. So, for example, monumental building. This is one of the key features that when civilizations come together and they can have leadership that can pool or pull together resources of a society, what can we do with those resources? What should we do with them? So we get things, and we'll get to this in the next lecture, we get to things like the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt. And in England, very early on in the Neolithic civilization of England, we get Stonehenge. So having this idea of monumental building, pooling resources, having the resources to actually do something like Stonehenge is one of the issues. The other idea here is certainly in monumental building, you've got technology, you've got some understanding of architecture, engineering, those kinds of issues. Also, what's the purpose of this monumental building, right? What's the aim of this? You'll see in many civilizations that monumental building, great building structures, sometimes had something to do with observations of the heavens. We think in Mesopotamia, the Mesopotamians you'll hear about developed the first calendar that had 366 days. It was off a bit. The Egyptians will develop, the Egyptians with their pyramids, often arranged, organized in a way that was consistent with the compass points, right? We also think the Egyptians' pyramids, the Great Pyramid, may have lined up with some of the stars that we see in the heavens. With regard to Stonehenge, we think that this too is one of the reasons that Stonehenge was built, and also one of the reasons behind the way it was built was to somehow use it as a way to craft a calendar, to keep track of celestial events, to maybe have those celestial events associated with what we might call the seasons, right? So we'll talk more about that. So monumental building in the ancient world connected to science and technology. First of all, the ideas of engineering, architecture, pulling together large amounts of people and resources to make these things happen. Secondly, the uses for some of this monumental building, in addition to sort of shoring up the state, if you will, in addition to sort of showing how powerful the state could be, also important, we think, for helping us to understand the calendar, the passing of months, years, agricultural seasons. So here we go, after that long explanation. Moonshine, and we're going to feature Stonehenge. This is a nice little map of the British Isles, and so here you see England highlighted in yellow, and down here, of course, in this little nice red dot is Stonehenge. Here's an aerial view, and many of you probably have seen this before. But here we have, if you can follow the arrow, we have this amazing circular ditch that goes all around the facility, all around the venue. That is itself ancient. That's nothing new. You have this great outlier stone here. You have all this circle. Now it is incomplete today. Things do fall down. People have moved some of the stones away. But we think in antiquity it was a complete circle. What you see here with people walking along this road, this is an access road. This is a national park, an international heritage site today. And so if you want to visit Stonehenge, you'll walk along here. You cannot today get inside the venue except on certain times of the year. Here's an image that is sort of a ground level view, and one of a sort of a spectacularly clear day, surprisingly clear day in England. Here is a group of tourists again on that little access road. taking a look a little bit from a distance. What you're supposed to notice with these great monoliths is that these stones are just tons of rock. They come from about 30 miles away from the site, so they had to be transported some 30 miles away and then set upright, as you can see. And then across the top, we have this sort of post and lintel affair, right? And so you get not only these posts, but here's a rock here from side to side that sort of connects them, much like you might do, Legos or Tinker Toys or something, some kind of building set. So a brilliant achievement. Again, we mentioned earlier that we think that there's something to do with the alignment of the stones and the observations that people made about, from their perspective, the movement of the sun. So we'll get more into that. Oh, this image is reflective of the one time of year that people are allowed to get inside the venue and hang out. This is a party, really, going on at the summer solstice. The summer solstice is the longest day of the year. It's when the sun is out the most amount of time, and it's when the sun actually sets in this fashion at Stonehenge. It sets on a particular lineup of the stones. And people today, whether they believe it's a religious experience or they believe it's just a great party, or they're just celebrating the history of this oldest site in England, or one of the oldest sites in England, they come out, and as you can see, lots of drumming going on, and just general good time partying. And this is just another image of people enjoying the stones. Again, you can only do this once a year. And if you want to go to Stonehenge and you want to be engaged in this kind of gathering, again, plan for the summer solstice. That's in July. If you don't, I think it's July, yeah, typically July or June. Yeah. And do then avoid it if you don't want to get engaged in the party. This is a model that aims to show where we think most of the stones used to be. As you can see, there's this nice little circle here. We can still see a few of the stones perhaps that were in this outside circle. Then you have the inner circle of what they think it'll look like originally. There's sort of a horseshoe effect here, right? And then the idea that the sun's rays, the light goes through at different times of the year, right? So we think of the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and then the times of year when day and night are equal, and those are the equinoxes, right? So summer solstice here, winter solstice here, and then the vernal and the autumnal equinox coming through the site. So just a brief overview of the facts of Stonehenge, right? And sorry, lots of information on one slide. I tell you shouldn't do that, but this is the basic information. It was built sometime between 3100 and 1500 BC. So some suggest as old as the pyramids, if not older. Others say, well, actually, maybe it's a little younger than that. There's a lot of discussion about the age, and as you can see, it's very broadly aligned. Some people in England wanted to make the Stonehenge older than the pyramids, and there's maybe not a whole lot of evidence for that. Most folks tend to date Stonehenge to around 1500 BC. Let's see. They believe that given the technology of the day and given how much work had to be done, and we said before the stones were quarried about 30 miles away, some 30 million man-hours to build what we think Stonehenge was. They had to move about 3,500 cubic yards of earth to make that circle you saw in the embankment. It's a 350-foot circle. The heel stone, one of the biggest stones there, is 35 tons. There are blue stones, 5 tons each. There are those uprights that you saw for the outer stone circles, some 25 tons each. The lintels, the ones that go across, 7 tons each. Inside the stone circle, there's 5 trilithons, right? These are 3 stone figures, 3 stone connections, and they're 30 tons each on average. The largest of these stones, 50 tons. So a lot of work going into moving and setting these stones up. The stones are laid out in a true circle. So when we're trying to think of reasoning, mathematical reasoning. One of the things of Stonehenge is these are laid out in a true circle. It may have been a religious center. It may be that this is an indication that celestial bodies were somehow connected to the religion of these early peoples, either through some kind of worship or veneration, or maybe just to help them set a calendar for when certain religious festivals should happen. The stones are aligned such that the sunrise on the summer solstice lines up with that giant heel stone, as we were saying earlier. From within the sanctuary, the sun can be seen to rise at the most northern point. Now, it's not true north, but it's the most northern point. It also marks the sunrise at the winter solstice, as we said, and the sun sets at the equinoxes. Also, what's interesting, and not a whole lot of ancient culture did this, it's also following lunar motion. So they're seeing that the Stonehenge also at certain places marked where the moon ought to be at its four extremes in the view that one would have of the moon from the earth. So clearly, circle formation and charting from the perspective of an earth, the movements of the heavens. So what kind of conclusions about science can we derive from Stonehenge? The folks engaged at Stonehenge are making detailed observations. So we are keeping detailed records. You couldn't set up Stonehenge the way it is set up today if you weren't keeping detailed observations of the movements of the heavens. It's a scientific approach reflecting an understanding of the regularities in celestial motion, so that there are regularities there, and that's what we're charting, and we're understanding that. Your book will talk about how this also offers sort of intellectual control, if you will, over a calendar. And the other thing to note is it's not the only stone circle in England. It's one of the most prominent, but there are several other stone circles in England, and we're not really quite sure if there are connections between them or if this was just different groups on the same wavelength, if you will, also creating these kinds of circles in order to craft a calendar for their communities. So we'll wrap up this selection, this video, with this last picture of Stonehenge. And just to remind you of some of the main features of monumental building, we'll get to some more examples when we go to our next essay, our next presentation. But keeping in mind this idea that in these early civilizations, moving from Paleolithic to Neolithic, one of the great features of civilizations across the globe is an attempt to craft extraordinary building projects. In Stonehenge, one of them that represents the ability to amass a lot of resources, a lot of human energy, put together things in a way that reflect an understanding of mathematics and an understanding of the observation of the heavens. So some of our first indications of science and technology in the ancient world.